Hello everybody, and welcome to my Mythic Plus range tier list for patch 8.2.5. So this is the final Mythic Plus tier list for this patch that I'll be making, but I'll be making another set for Raid in the coming weeks as well, so be sure to check those out. If you're interested in the other parts of this series and a video explaining what each of the tiers means, those will be in the description below. But for now, let's get started off, and I'm going to try doing these in reverse order after some feedback I got recently saying that it might be better. So let me know if you prefer these from the bottom up or from the top down. Let's start off though in the F tier. In Ranged, we do have a couple of F tier specs. The lowest spec that I'm going to place on this list is Affliction Warlock. Affliction Warlock's damage profile is fundamentally pretty bad for Mythic Plus, this expansion in particular. It takes a lot of time to ramp up their damage. They're pretty cooldown dependent, and they don't bring very much utility. Health stones are a nice thing to have, although every group can have access to 3 health stones by just getting a Warlock in the group before the key starts. So having a Warlock in the group only gives you the 4th through 10th best health stones throughout the dungeon. It doesn't give you those 3 best health stones that you use each dungeon. It brings a battle res, and Soulstone is a little bit special. Like, it's a preemptive battle res, which can be useful if you know that your tank's going to die on a boss to necrotic stacks or whatever, or there are some skips that it enables. You put a Soulstone on your healer and everybody runs through, and then you take the Soulstone and res up afterwards. Sometimes that can be a safer way to do a skip. And they have Warlock Gateway, which is useful in a couple spots. There's some places in Freehold, Siege of Borealis, maybe even a couple other places where that lets you do some cool skips. But in general, it's a pretty low utility spec, and Affliction in general, also the damage is just not very good for Mythic Plus. The other spec I have in the F tier is Arcane Mage. So Arcane Mage brings an immunity. They bring an offensive purge with Spell Seal. Affliction Warlock can do a bunch of that sort of stuff actually as well. And they bring the Arcane Intellect buff for the group, which is slightly better than the Scroll. But outside of that, they're pretty low utility. They don't offer very much control for packs. They really don't interact very much with the dungeon. And they're pretty low damage. That damage is it's very possible for their damage to get messed up when they're in their cooldowns, if they have to move. And also they're not very good at like Mythic Plus. Like the damage, they're good at single target damage, pretty good at single target damage, but it scales less well into a Mythic Plus environment. All right, up in the D tier we have Destruction Warlock. So Destruction Warlock does do pretty good damage, but it is also fairly cooldown dependent. It's better than Affliction. It's a lot better in terms of how the damage looks for Mythic Plus. But it has all the same utility problems that I mentioned when talking about Affliction Warlock. There's not really any cool Destro stuff that you get access to. The other spec in the D tier is Demonology Warlock. So we have all 3 of these Warlock specs down in the bottom 2 tiers, which Demonology actually has a pretty good kit for Mythic Plus. There's a lot of, I guess not a good kit, but a lot of good damage for Mythic Plus. But one problem with that is that in order to get their full damage, they need to sacrifice their interrupt. And in Battle for Azeroth, that's just a pretty big thing to sacrifice in most dungeons. And then if your Demonology Warlock is like bringing out their interrupt pack for half of the pulls, then they're going to do less damage than the other Warlock specs would also. So it's a pretty big sacrifice, and that's a big thing that keeps them down in this D tier. And in fact, the main reason that these range specs are able to go into the F and D tiers is that they don't bring that melee kick. You'll notice when we did our melee tier list, none of the specs made it into the F tier because having a melee kick is actually just a huge piece of utility, and having that 15 seconds instead of 24 is a big deal. All right, up in the C tier now. Up in the C tier, the first spec that I want to put in the C tier is Marksmanship Hunter. So Marksmanship Hunter does pretty good damage. They are target capped like Fury Warriors are, which means that when you go above 5 targets, they stop really scaling their damage all that effectively. Their multi-shot continues to hit everything, but multi-shot gives them a buff that makes some of their other shots, I don't actually know what the abilities are, only hit them, they cleave onto 5 targets maximum. So that is a pretty big drawback for Mythic Plus. Not as big as it was during Reaping, but still quite a big drawback for Mythic Plus. But their damage is good overall outside of that, kind of like Fury's, but less so. They do have an immunity, and Binding Shot is actually a pretty useful cooldown, especially in high keys. That really facilitates, like in a coordinated group, it's a really useful thing for a tank to have access to is Binding Shot. So that's a nice thing for Hunter, and it scales really nicely into those coordinated groups. The next spec in the C tier is the other ranged Hunter spec, Beast Mastery Hunter. So Beast Mastery Hunter is pretty similar to Marksmanship. The only difference really is how it does its damage. It's got pretty similar utility. It's got a little bit more survivability with like Spirit Mend pets, but the damage is actually pretty good in big AoE, unlike Marksmanship. They have a cooldown reduction effect per target that they hit with multi-shot, so they can be in their cooldowns pretty much permanently if you're pulling that big enough. But again, that's less of a thing here in Season 3 than it was back in Season 2, now that Reaping has gone away. The final spec in the C tier is Frost Mage. Frost Mage is pretty good for mob control. They slow things down a lot, which really helps tanks kite. And there are some specific pulls that Frost Mages can, like all the mobs at the start of Toldagor. There have been some groups that have successfully used the strategy of just pulling it all and having a Frost Mage, slow it and kite it. That doesn't really work with there's Emissary of the Tides involved, which there usually is, but when there's not, that's a cool thing that Frost Mages have access to. But outside of that, their damage is pretty lackluster this patch. They do good priority damage, which means they do good single target when there are adds around the target that they want to damage, which is a nice characteristic for damage this patch, and kind of just always. And they do have an immunity, but outside of that, just the overall damage is, I think, low enough to put them into the C tier. It's kind of a hard spec to evaluate. Statistically, it's just tough to look and see how good Frost Mage is, because there is a better mage spec, and so you don't really see the good mages that would be able to make Frost look good actually play Frost this tier. Up in the B tier now, we're going to start off with Shadow Priest. Shadow Priest does very good damage. That's kind of the big thing that's having them so highly rated. It's just great damage in Mythic Plus, especially if your tank is able to chain pull. Shadow has a trait called Chorus of Insanity that gives them a bunch of crit when they end their Void form, and that crit slowly decays, but if they drop combat, all the crit goes away. So staying in combat is pretty important for them to be able to keep that damage up, and also staying in combat just helps them stay in Void form too sometimes, so that can be a useful thing. If the tank isn't chain pulling, their damage will fall off pretty substantially. Vampiric Embrace is a nice piece of utility they have, a little bit of off-healing. There are some fights in particular where it's really nice, and there are some affixes, like Grievous, against which it's really nice. And in alliance groups in particular, Shadow Priest brings a lot of utility because alliance groups are missing the Blood Elf Arcane Torrent that Horde groups get access to, and Shadow Priests have Mass Dispel, which covers that hole. The next spec in the B tier is Elemental Shaman. Elemental Shaman also kind of up here just on the merits of damage being a main thing that keeps them above these other specs in the lower tiers that you might be like, hey, there's sort of similar utility suites. They do have an Earth Elemental that they can directly control, which is very useful. It's on a 5-minute cooldown, but it's like mega trees, basically, that, Balanced Druid has trees. Elemental Shaman has, on a longer cooldown, a stronger effect. They have, they're not particularly durable. They have a defensive shield wall that's on like a 90-second cooldown, but it's pretty low percent, and they're pretty likely to die to certain effects compared to other specs that have immunities. And they have access to Thunderstorm. Thunderstorm is a pretty useful thing against Emissary of the Tides in particular. You can have a pack where the Emissary of the Tides just comes in, and there's one important kick. The Elemental Shaman can then Thunderstorm right before that important kick needs to be made, and then kick. And then Thunderstorm is a really powerful knock, so it will knock the Emissary of the Tides far enough away that you can kick the target, and it won't scatter the whole pack like Thunderstorm normally does, because everything else is CC immune when you cast it, because the Emissary of the Tides is there. So that particular piece of utility ends up working up pretty nicely against certain pulls where you do need to interact, and there's also an Emissary of the Tides, but you only need to interact once. You don't need to keep kicking something that's in the pack. So that's a cool little thing that you get access to when you play with an Elemental Shaman. They also have a real Bloodlust, as do the Mage specs and the Hunter specs, which is a minor but non-zero benefit that they bring. The next spec in the B tier is Balanced Druid. I was actually pretty conflicted here. I was thinking about maybe putting this up in the A tier, but I was talked down to B tier largely by a Balanced Druid. They bring excellent utility, especially if you don't have a Resto Druid. They cover a lot of the things that Resto Druid brings. So if you are playing with like a Mistweaver or Holy Paladin or any of the other non-Resto Druid specs, Balanced Druid brings Entangling Roots, they bring Soothe, they bring Typhoon. Those are the kind of abilities that many routes that are designed based around those. So if you're playing with a group that is, they've designed their pulls assuming that you're going to have a Typhoon for a certain ability in a certain spot, a Balanced Druid is a really good thing to bring if you're not going to have a Resto Druid for that. They're also very good with non-Resto Druids because they bring Innervate, and mana problems are something that a lot of specs that aren't Resto Druid have. I'm thinking Disc Priest, Mistweaver Monk. So a very good cover for not having a Resto Druid in your group. However, many of the top groups do run Resto Druid, and some of those even choose to play with Balanced Druid even though they have a Resto Druid. So there are a lot of other good reasons to bring a Balanced Druid. They're pretty tanky. It's pretty hard for a Balanced Druid to die if they correctly use their defensives and shift into bear form as needed. They have off heals, which is pretty useful in a couple spots and against a couple affixes. Actually, every spec that we have up here in the B tier does bring these off heals. And they have Innervate. I already talked about that. Okay, let's talk about their damage. Their damage is great on single target. They get these Vision of Perfection procs, which means that they can do pretty good damage even when their cooldown, like even though their Incarnation is a pretty big cooldown, and it's on a pretty long cooldown, they get these random procs that mean they can do pretty good damage even spread out over when their cooldown is down. They don't do very good AoE. The AoE is kind of the big thing holding Balanced Druids back. As you start getting to these high number of targets, first of all, you need to get to like 8 targets before it's even better for them to press Starfall than Star Surge. And the fact that that's true should be an indication of how bad Starfall is as a button this expansion. It's really been nerfed dramatically since Legion. I remember back in Legion there was a build that pressed Starfall on 1 target, so that can show you how far it's fallen. But yeah, so as you get to these bigger number of targets, Balanced Druid does fall off, and that is a big problem for them in Mythic Plus, but it's really the only problem that the spec has anymore. And as we've moved from Season 2 with Reaping to Season 3 with Beguiling, that drawback has gotten less important, and so they've moved up in the tier list. The last spec on today's tier list is Fire Mage, and I'm going to put them in the A tier, so I'm going to leave the S tier empty for range specs, because I believe that there is not a range spec that deserves to be in the S tier right now, just based on... I don't think it's necessary to have a range in your groups. Many groups play triple melee. If you are going to play with a ranged spec, the most common one is the Fire Mage. Fire Mage damage is phenomenal during combustion, especially this patch. They've gained a lot of great tools. They've gained the Memory of Lucid Dreams essence in both the major and the minor slots. It's fantastic. And they've gained the Hyperthread wrist straps. So the combination of those means that they basically, during their combustion, they can hit Fire Blast every single global. And that means that they can just be, their entire combustion can just be Fire Blast, Pyroblast, Fire Blast, Pyroblast. It's hard to say those words back to back, actually. You should try that. It's difficult, but they can just keep doing that, and it does huge amounts of damage every 2 minutes. They're pretty low damage outside their combustion, but the damage inside combustion is massive. And it's great for these, like if you're going to pull an Emissary of the Void and you have combustion for it, it's going to get 1 less cast than if you didn't have a Fire Mage in your group with combustion there. And you basically aren't going to have to worry about it in the same way that you would without a Fire Mage. And there's a lot of pulls where there's just priority targets in packs. Even Emissary of the Tide sometimes needs to die, and having a Fire Mage do that. Mages can also spam Polymorph Emissaries, which is useful if you don't have a Druid for spamming roots on them. So that's another piece of utility they have against Beguiling. And Fire Mage also brings Dragon's Breath, which is a nice little bit of utility. But in general, it's a lower utility mage spec than, say, Frost. It doesn't bring that huge free slow that Frost always has. The main thing that has it up in this high tier is just that massive damage that they have this patch from the Memory of Lucid Dreams essence and the Hyperthread wrist traps, which are bracers that drop from Mechagon, and that basically reduces the cooldown of their Fire Blast by a huge amount. So those effects are what puts Fire Mage up in the A tier. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, remember to like and subscribe. Check out my Twitch channel, twitch.tv/Dratnos, and let me know in the comments where you disagree with this tier list. I think there's definitely room for some of these specs to maybe be a tier higher or lower than where I put them. So I'd love to have that discussion with you in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.